Hi and welcome back. In the last session, we have created up a form to submit the data to create a post, and then we saw the listing of the post using the pagination. Now today we are going to talk about the validation, because in the last session when we created up our form, if I'm going to submit a blank form, let's open up first the form. So now if I'm going to submit this form as like blank form, it is going to give us the database error, which is not the good way to show the errors first of all. So if there are errors, we should handle it, right? So if there are any kind of errors, we should handle it. Might be we should tell that okay, title is required, post content is required. So validation can be at the client side or validation can be at the server side. Now when I'm talking about the client side validation, I can use jQuery or I can use the required attribute of the HTML5. If I'm using up the jQuery validation library on the client side, as soon as I click on the submit button, it will check whether the text field is having some text or not, or some other type of validation which we want. Second type of validation is the server side. This kind of validation for the data will be done when the request is submitted. So when I'm clicking on submit, whether the form is filled or it is empty, the data will be passed to your Laravel application, to the server. Now at the server, your Laravel application is going to check as per your validations which you may have mentioned, whether the data is available. If it is available, what is the minimum length, whether it is crossing the maximum limit, and a few other validations which you are going to add. So let's start with the server side validation, right? We are going to implement the server side validation, that when the request is submitted to this store method, how are we going to validate our data? Okay, so now we understood validation is important because the first thing is it will show us the error page, right? It might reveal the code also, and if you are not adding the validation, maybe some wrong kind of data can go into your database, right? So validation is important. Now how can we put this validation? How are we going to put this validation? One option is that you can go and write up if else condition by checking whether the data which we require is available in the request or not. For example, I can go and say $request input and title. So here, if this value is null, right? If this value is null, then I can throw some exception, or I can save the errors inside an array and then return that array to the as a response, or I can pass it to the session, right? But again, this would be a lengthy task. You can have like 10 fields or 15 fields. You have to go and map each and every one. So if it is you are checking for title, might be you need to go and check for its length also. So Laravel has done some work on this also, right? Laravel has done some work. It is saying that okay, if you want to validate the data, I'm giving you a request validation method which you can pass the rules, and if everything is good, the code will continue, and if the validation is failed, it will redirect to the previous page, right? So let's write up a basic validation that both my title and the content field are required, right? Both my title and the content field are required. So let's go and write the validation part. So here I'm using the request object. I'll call the validate method, and inside the validate method, you are going to pass the array of rules, right? In the array of rules, the key will be the field, right? The key will be the field which you are getting from the request. So here it will be title, and then I'm going to put some rules over here. So there are already predefined rules. There are already predefined validation rules, like if the field is required, you just need to write over here required. Then I'll put a comma. Second one is content. Here also I'm going to use required. Okay, so I'm going to use two validations, validation required for the both fields, title and the content, right? So now this request is being validated. This request is being validated for title should be available in the request, content should be available in the request. Now let's see what happens if I'm submitting up a blank form, right? If I'm submitting up the blank form, let's save this and we'll go back to our form, refresh this page, click on submit and see it's redirecting back to this same page. Go to the inspect elements network tab, click on all, click on now submit. That means you submit the form and see this is your request, post, and see the headers. What happened over here when you are submitting the form, it is post method, but it is the status code is 302. 302 is the status code for redirection. Okay, that means when the form was submitted to this URL, the validation error was raised and the request was redirected. Where was it redirected, right? It was redirected to this location. See the response headers, it was redirected again to your form, right? It was redirected again to your form, but we cannot see any errors over here. So to make the errors visible on this page, we have to write some code inside our view. Okay, let's go to the create view and here we are going to write some error list, right? We are going to display the errors from the error list. Now how Laravel is handling this thing actually? When Laravel is validating the form or validating the request, if there are any validation error messages, right? So what it does, it picks up the errors, makes up a list of errors and then pushes it to the session, right? It creates an error variable and then pushes it to the session. Now this session variable would be available over here. You don't need to fetch it, right? You don't need to declare it. It is available by default. So here we are going to use the if condition. Again, we'll use the if from the blade template. So you don't need to add the parenthesis, right? So here it will be and if. So inside if, I'm going to write if there are any errors. Okay, so if I'm checking the errors variable is having any record, that means there is an error existing, right? So what I'll do, I'll write some UI to present that errors. So we'll add a div, we'll add a class alert -danger. So that will show the error. And now I need to present a unordered list. So inside the unordered list, we'll use a for each loop @for each, and I will iterate through the errors. So here I'm picking up all the errors which are pushed to session as $error. Okay, and now you can use your list tag to display the error. So let's type the error over here. Okay, so now I have created up a and if yeah, this is good. So now we are checking whether there is any error in the session, right? Because errors object is passed to the session. This is available in your view, so you don't have to write the code for checking the session, fetching the errors from the session. If the errors are pushed to the session, this object would available in your view, right? And remember, don't change the error word. It should be errors only. So don't declare ERR or ER or error only, right? It should be errors, and you are calling the function any. So here let's go and resubmit our form. So I'm going to submit it blank first. Let's refresh this. So our latest UI is rendered and submit. So you can see it's presenting the error. The title field is required, the content field is required, and we have not written these messages. These messages are already been defined inside the resource file. So in the in the lang file, go to the validation, and here you can see all the messages are given. You can change the messages as per your need, right? We'll also see some other way how we can customize the error by not making changes in the default file. I don't prefer changing it in the default file, right? So this is the first step that you can implement the validation. Now I want this validation to be more good looking by putting it below, just below the fields. So if it is a title field error, then it should be presented below the title field. If it is a content field error, then go to the content field, right? So we are going to make a small change. We are going to make a small change in the UI here. Instead of putting it as a list at this point, right, we are going to mention it inside the field over here. So let's write up over here. Right. @ error. So if error has a title key, right? So this blade template would be checking whether the errors would be having a title key, and if it exists, it will execute the given code, right? So inside this, we are going to write div class equals alert hyphen danger, and give the message $message, right? So let's save this. Okay, I'll just remove this yeah, and put it in a new file. Okay, so let's run this part. If there is an error for content, it won't be displaying it because we have not yet presented it. We have not added it in the UI. So I'm just going to test it for the title. So this is my form. Click on submit and you can see it's presenting the title field is required. Okay, we can also highlight this text field, right? We can also highlight this text field that if there is an error, right? If there is an error, so it should add the class for showing that error, that this field is invalid. So here we are going to add @ error if the error is in the title is hyphen invalid and error. Okay, so I'm going to add this part which will add the is invalid class to this field. Let's refresh this once again. Blank submit, and you can see it's showing up some icon over here that there is some error for this field, right? And same you can implement for the content part also. Let's go and copy this, put it over here. Title changed to content, and right. Okay, so here message content, so this is fine. Let's go back, refresh the page, submit, and you can see 1 second, there is some error. Oh, my bad. I need to keep it in the class. I have added it inside the ID. That was wrong. It should be in the class. Placed it in the wrong attribute. Okay, submit, and yes, you can see the icon is inside both the text fields, text area and text field. Okay. So this is how you are going to add the validation. Now, what are the different type of validations you can put? Let's add one more validation over here. Required, and I say the title should be of minimum 3 letters. Minimum 3 letters, right? So here I'm mentioning up minimum 3. Maximum it can be, let's say, 20. So if I'm writing more than 20 characters, that will be also a validation error. If I'm writing 1 or 2 characters, that is also a validation error, right? And the messages would also be updated in this case. Okay, let's write up th, submit this. See, the message is updated. The title must be at least 3 characters. The content field is required. But if you see this point over here, very important, I have written some character in this, and let's say this is a post content. Now as soon as I submit, this is going to throw a validation error, right? And it will redirect back to this form. So suppose if you have added up a lot of post content and some post title, some validation error occurred, the page redirected, and you are going to lose everything, right? All the content that you have written is lost. So how can we manage this thing? How can we manage this thing? So if I am losing the post title over here, which was very small like th, but if I have written the whole post content and I lose this thing, I have to go back and type it again, right? So here Laravel has a method through which when the page is redirected, you can fetch the old input from the request. You can fetch the old input from the request and update it inside the form, right? So how are we going to do that? Let's go to the index create blade. We'll go to the create blade, and here we will add the value field in our input. So let's add the value equals, I'll use a helper method old, okay? And inside this I'm going to give the field name. The field name is title. I'll use title. Okay, let's refresh one field, change this one field and refresh the page and see how it works. So I'm going to add a th, I'm going to add this is a content, submit, and you can see th is repopulated, right? It is populated even the page was when redirected, right? After the error, page is redirected, but your value is still populated. You are not losing that value. You don't have to retype, or at least the user can see, okay, I entered this value, that's why I got this error, right? So these kind of things can be helpful for user not to retype his data, and he can see what was the data because of which error was raised, or because of one field you are not losing the other fields. Okay, so let's implement the same inside the content field also. Let's put it over here. So old field, and here we are going to write, we'll put it over here. Title, and here we are going to write old content. Let's test this. So th content, submit, and I'm getting some blank value over here. Let's verify why. Might be this is the reason. th, okay, ignore that blank space. Th and content. So here I have added a rule that the minimum validation, the minimum number of characters should be 3, right? And this is going to throw an error, and I want that my fields should not lose their data. So that is fine. Content is being displayed over here. Title must be at least 3 characters. So that is also displaying, right? Go back to let's put the maximum. Let's check the maximum validation also. This is a title. Okay, this is obviously more than 20 characters. Submit, and here you can see title must not be greater than 20 characters. So validation looks good. There are a lot of validations rules. If you want to check the start date, end date should not be before start date. Then we can check the type of the file being submitted, right? The MIME types. So all those type of validations are provided, right? If you are passing an array, it should be an array, its length should be this. If I want to check the key of the array, that also is available. So I'll pass the link of the validation rules in the description of this video. One quick thing we'll look at. Now you are adding the request validation over here, all right? you are adding a request validation over here. There is a very small code at this point, but let's suppose if you have like 10 or 15 fields, that means in the controller you are going to write a lot of code. In the controller you are going to write a lot of code. So to avoid this thing, we can use the request form classes, right? Form request classes. Sorry, I pronounced it like opposite way. It is the form request classes. So how to create a form request, right? How to create a form request? Go to the terminal, type a command php artisan make a request, and since I'm creating a post, I'll call it as a create post request. So it's like you are creating a custom request object. Instead of using this particular request object, I'll use now create post request. Okay, and I'm going to move this request validation code to the create post request. So my controller is again very clean. I don't have to write up a lot of validation code here. All the validation handling can be done inside the create post request. Now create post request can also handle the authorization, right? But I'll not talk about the authorization right now. We'll touch the base this when we will be doing up the authorization part, authorization and authentication. So now see here they are giving you a method rules which is returning an array, and at this point you can write up your rules. Okay, so my rules were title array key, and the value would be required, then pipe, and here comes the minimum, that is 3, then pipe maximum, that is let's say 20. Okay, and second one is content. Now suppose if you want to put some validation, right, that the maximum value should be, let's say 256 character, assume, and we are not going to write it as required. Okay, and this can be minimum of like 3 characters, 4 characters or 10 characters, but then it can be nullable also. It can be nullable. So if you want that a field is nullable, you can mention it as a nullable field. The validation is that this field can either be nullable or it can have the following validations. Okay, so this field may not be required. So I can submit only the title, and title should be of minimum 3 and maximum 20 characters. Right, now how to implement this, how to call this a request inside your post controller store method? Simply instead of using the request class, use the create post request. Right, let's save this, go back to the browser and refresh this page, click on submit. Wow, it says action is unauthorized. The reason is because by default in the authorization it is returning false, right? So for now I'm going to remove this. We'll come back to it, the authorization, when we will be doing up the authorization sessions. Okay, so there is no authorization check in the request for now. Let's go back, refresh this, click submit, and see it says title field is required. I'm only passing 2 characters. It says minimum 3 is required, so I pass so many characters. It says maximum 20 is required, and content can also be test, submit, and you are getting this data. Okay, so this is how you are going to handle the validation. There are a lot of validation rules. I'll pass the link in the description, and when we'll be writing up the project, we'll see a lot of validation rules at that time also. That's all for today's session. I would request everyone to subscribe to this YouTube channel, share the videos with your colleagues who are looking for the beginner tutorials in Laravel. Thank you everyone. Bye.